Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We have a really very impactful and informative webinar today, so I am glad that there's a good number of folks that are joining. So I'm just going to give folks a little bit of time to log in, just so that folks get all the information from the very beginning. So as we're waiting for folks to log in, I'm wondering if you can just share your role, maybe where you're joining us from. And ideally, if you actually utilize play therapy in your practice, what are some challenges that you might have encountered? And if you haven't implemented play therapy, what are some concerns that you might have? Just so that we kind of get a sense of who's joining us and what are some of the questions that you might be bringing to today's webinar. So please, again, if you can just go ahead and share your role, where you're joining us from, and any thoughts and concerns around the potential use or actual implementation of play therapy, that would be great. So again, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center at NYU's McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research. And I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Healing Trauma in Children with Play Therapy with Dr. Ritchie Rubio. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to orient everyone so you know how to participate in today's event. Upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the CTEC host who will be able to assist you. And if you would like to activate the closed captions, you can do so by clicking the toolbar where it says live transcript, and then you can select show subtitles. We will have a Q&A portion toward the end, but please submit your questions using the chat box at any point in time during the webinar, and we'll try to get through as many as we can towards the end of the presentation. At the end of today's presentation, we do also have a short feedback survey, and we would appreciate you completing it. Your feedback and suggestions do help to inform our future offerings. And lastly, the recording and slides for this presentation will be posted on the CTEC website, ctecny.org, within the next 2 to 3 business days. We are also offering CEs. So on the following slide, I just want to highlight a couple of things for you to know. We are offering 1.5 continuing education credits free of charge for the viewing and recorded viewing of this presentation. To be eligible, you must be a licensed social worker or a licensed mental health counselor, be in attendance for at least 75% of the webinar. You must also use your own unique Zoom-generated link. So if you're sharing a link, that unfortunately is not acceptable, as well as using a computer, as attending via a cell phone is also not acceptable for CEs. For those that are eligible, you will be receiving a detailed email with all the information within 2 to 3 business days. But if you have any CE-related questions, you can reach out to the NYU Silver School via phone or email at silver.continuingeducation@nyu.edu. Now, before we get started, I do want to introduce our presenter who has been with us for a couple of other presentations as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ritchie Rubio. He is currently the Director of Practice and Improvement and Analytics of the Children, Youth, and Family System of Care at the San Francisco Department of Public Health in California. In this role, he plays and coordinates a clinical practice improvement and evaluation program focused on identifying best trauma-informed practices and utilizing implementation science to design and strengthen clinical assessment and interventions. He is also an adjunct professor. Dr. Rubio has worked as a clinical child psychologist, systems leader, researcher, storyteller, program educator, statistical consultant, and national telehealth expert consultant, and associate professor and lecturer in a variety of clinical and academic settings. So we are very excited to once again have Dr. Rubio with us. So again, to everyone, thank you for joining us, and I will now pass it along to Dr. Rubio to get us started.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you to CTEC for this wonderful opportunity to be here again to share to you some of my humble competence and expertise around integrating play therapy into trauma responsive work. Now, to orient you in terms of different models and also theories, and also different tools that you could use in play therapy in working with kids who have been trauma exposed, I often want to anchor it within a client story. So I'm going to share a story of a client I worked with a couple of years ago. And this is the story of Mai, not her real name, also not her real picture, just to give life to the story. Mai is the daughter of Kim and Min. She was born in Vietnam. The family moved to California when she was 3, looking for a better life. Mai's grandmother joined them later. Mai grew to be very attached to her grandmother, and grandma's joining them was because both parents have to work full time, so barely have any time really for caregiving for Mai. As a family, they practice Buddhism. However, when Mai was 5, grandma passed away. It was due to natural causes. And Mai really had difficulty adjusting to the loss, even months or years after the passing away of grandma. Some of her presentations included crying endlessly in her preschool, sleep difficulties, including nightmares, night terrors, always wanting mom to sleep by her. And for the family, life was not really easy for them. They were very stressed as a family navigating life in the US for many years. Both Kim and Min worked multiple jobs at some point and barely have time to take care of their daughter. Min, the dad, on top of that, had a drinking problem. Kim, the mom, often stressed, will take it out on Mai by screaming at her for any misbehavior or for any call for attention, and especially at night when Mai, according to her, would be very clingy and would always want to be by her. Min and Kim also have heated arguments with swearing, insulting. Sometimes it escalates to physical violence. Mai witnessed many of these growing up, and her parents eventually separated when Mai turned 7. I met Mai when she was 10. She was in 5th grade at that time. According to her teacher, she performs really poorly, doesn't talk much, often withdrawn from group engagement, has a few friends, but also, even with her few friends, she barely engages a lot with them. She appears anxious, angry, and often withdrawn. And there are many times she would complain of stomach aches and headaches that would warrant a visit to the school nurse. I share that story in terms of also trying to approach it in a trauma responsive or trauma informed way to really understand that a client story can often be viewed as like an iceberg, right? Many times as a clinician, we tend to focus on the tip of the iceberg, the presenting problems, the referral questions, right? And then we target them for change. However, a trauma informed mantra is we do not target for change what we do not yet understand. And often in the trauma informed world, there's often this question about really shifting the way we approach cases or client stories from what is wrong with the client to really what happened to the client, really pausing first to reflect on that question, what happened to the client? And that question is really looking more into what's underneath the iceberg, the waterline, the bigger part of the iceberg, in terms of really looking at predisposing, precipitating events that might have led to the presentation of a client. In this case, in listening to my story, we've heard a lot of stories of trauma exposure in her life story. And given also her family's immigration story, right? We could also think about any trauma exposures around that experience. And even coming here to the US, their whole journey of acculturation could potentially also be sources of stress and trauma for the family. So again, it's important to address the what happened to you in terms of really thinking about a trauma-informed approach. Much of what we know about trauma has been strengthened by our understanding of adverse childhood experiences. And in this study by Kaiser in the early 90s, they really distillated adverse childhood experiences into these 10 core or traditional uh, trauma exposure events in the life of a child: abuse, neglect, household challenges. And then based on that Kaiser study, right, they have associated it with a higher likelihood of experiencing physical and mental health presentations into adulthood. So, and they even had like a benchmark. If a child has had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, the likelihood of physical and mental health presentations in adulthood is increased. Like for Mai, you've heard from her story, she has at least 4 adverse childhood experiences. That increases her likelihood for suicidality 14 times, for depression 4.5 times, substance use 11 times, and many more. However, of course, we know they are associations, not necessarily causation. Of course, we know that with adverse childhood experiences, that might be a very limited way of really thinking about like trauma, just thinking about those 10 traditional trauma exposures. Wendy Ellis actually revisioned the theory to think more of other experiences that might impact many communities, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. Now, Mai belongs to the Asian American community. And given her experiences, we know that beyond her adverse childhood experiences, she has also been exposed to adverse community environments, right? And a lot of these happen too when her parents separated. They were in living, they had poor housing when her parents separated, and they were almost in poverty. And also, I met Mai and her family at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis when there was anti-Asian hate crimes all over the country and all over the news. And a lot of those were also very activating and stressful for the family. And you could see there's vicarious traumatization. That would also be considered an adverse community environment for them. Experiences of discrimination, microaggressions, community disruption, having to move from places. And currently, too, when I met with Mai at that time, she was living in a neighborhood wherein she witnesses a lot of community violence. That too is a source of adversity and trauma exposure. Now, given all that, just as a context of trauma, how are we going to help Mai? My model of really looking at trauma recovery has been informed by Judith Herman's work in terms of the stages of trauma recovery, wherein it really follows the neurodevelopmental patterns of the brain in terms of really looking to where to start in terms of the healing journey, wherein we start with safety and stabilization, helping a client be more safe, feel safe in their world, and be more stable in their body, in their emotions, in their environment, before you move to processing of the trauma story. And then later on, really strengthening post traumatic growth. And that's a part of the integration and post trauma growth. So for this webinar, given it's only really like 1.5 hours, I will be focusing on the first two and would not really have much time to focus on the final part of the journey. But I'm just showing this to really reinforce that the stages of trauma recovery follows this triphasic model. Now, many trauma experts have aligned the way they conceptualize trauma and trauma healing with Judith Herman's stages of trauma recovery as well. One groundbreaking work by Bessel van der Kolk, and if you're familiar with his work around The Body Keeps a Score, he has also revitalized and also re-envisioned how we think about trauma work in terms of some interventions might not be a good start in terms of thinking about trauma healing because of what happens in the brain and in the body of an individual when they have been exposed to trauma. According to van der Kolk, we remember trauma less in words and more with our bodies, with our feelings in our bodies. Thus, the body keeps a score. Sometimes you might have met clients wherein they may not have easy access to the verbal memory of their trauma. However, their body is in a state of alarm, wherein as if they are still being trauma exposed, in a state of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or like feign reactions, right, in their body. So it's almost like their body is trapped in the state of alarm around their trauma exposures. Now, given all that, according to van der Kolk and many other trauma experts who have aligned their interventions based on this triphasic model, it's important to start the healing in the body. And if we're looking at the brain, that's really healing around the brainstem. And then later on, healing around the limbic system, helping clients around emotion regulation before you move to healing, which impacts the executive functions of the brain around the frontal lobes. Now, given all that, I know this is work with kids, right? And this webinar is about focusing on kids. As part of psychoeducation, there are also ways by which you could bring this understanding to kids in a playful, creative, and interactive way, engaging way. So for me, my work with kids, many times I really pay attention to how I talk to them about asking them about their interests. What shows are they interested in? Any animated movies or shows they watch? Anything they like doing in their free time? And I try to find ways to integrate those into the work that I do. So, for example, with Mai, when I was asking her about interest, she mentioned to me about her favorite shows at that time. And one of them was Steven Universe. Luckily, I have kids, so I'm also familiar with the show Steven Universe. And then when I hear those interests from children, I do my own work in terms of like finding ways by which I could do a bridge of their interest with certain interventions I am working on. And sometimes I bring them as part of psychoeducation or as part of integration with specific interventions like relaxation or cognitive restructuring and many others. So here's one example when I was thinking about bringing this whole idea about how trauma becomes trapped in our bodies and how healing should start in our body. I brought this video to Mai based on her interest in the Steven Universe show. And luckily, sometimes you are lucky to find an appropriate video to drive home what you are intending to around psychoeducation around trauma. There you go.
Well, you seem to have made a series of miraculous recoveries, but that doesn't change the fact that you experienced trauma. You've recovered physically, but have you recovered mentally?
You think there's something wrong with my brain?
Not wrong. It's that adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma can have a lasting impact on how your body responds to stress. This can affect your social, emotional, and physical development. When humans are in crisis, the brain releases the hormone cortisol. Your heart races, your muscles tense. I wonder if your body is reacting to a gem equivalent of cortisol. Stephen, do you remember anything bad in your childhood that particularly stuck with you?
I guess I kind of freaked out when they canceled my favorite ice cream. And then I got attacked by a giant bug monster. And I got trapped in a bubble and almost drowned. I lost control of my body and turned into a blob of cats. I almost turned so old I died. Amethyst almost died. Pearl did die. Garnet got destabilized right in front of me. I woke up with a black eye imprisoned on a spaceship.
Stephen, this is serious.
But that was just the early stuff.
I think all these experiences have been subjecting your body to a harmful amount of stress, and that's affecting your ability to respond to new forms of stress in a healthy way. You've been dealing with genuine threats from such a young age. Your body is now responding to minor threats as if your life were in danger.
How lucky was that, right? And then when I brought that to Mai, like it really dawned to her, and she even mentioned it like, oh my gosh, I am so similar with Steven. And then she got the whole psychoeducation around adverse childhood experiences and its impact on her body in terms of being stuck in this state of like fight, flight, or like freeze reactions, as if she's still being exposed to all those traumas every day of her life. Also very important, especially if you're working with Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, clients, and families, right? The work of Resma Manikem is equally as powerful in terms of really thinking about race-based trauma. And if you've got a chance to really review his work, he also highlights and really supports the idea of really healing in the body first before you move to other types of interventions. A more accessible way of really thinking about that is the 3 R's model of Bruce Perry. And here, based on the neurodevelopmental uh, patterns of the brain, right? The 3 R's model is a bottom-up approach wherein you don't start with reasoning with a child in terms of intervention. You have to scale back, start with regulate, that's really around the brain stem, helping the client regulate in their body first. Relate around the limbic system of the brain, emotional processing, helping clients relate better with themselves, with their support system. And this is really where you could also work with parents or caregivers in terms of really strengthening their attachment with their kids before you move to interventions that really appeal to reason, like when we think about CBT work, narrative therapy, or even psychoanalytic types of like interventions. Also with this brain, even like with kids, it is also good to think about the hand model of the brain, right? And many times you could even use the work of Dan Siegel to really use your hand to simulate the brain, to give an example of how the brain works. And in the work of Dan Siegel, sometimes I just use my regular hand, but sometimes I could even use like a hand puppet to drive home the idea of what are the different sections of the brain and how they impact you. And in Dan Siegel, he has a way of making it more accessible to younger kids by talking about there are 2 sections of the brain. There is the downstairs brain and there is the upstairs brain. So this is a hand puppet. You see all the brain parts here from the brain stem. There's even the amygdala in here. I'm not sure if folks can see it, the seat of the emotions in the brain, right? And then here's the cortex. And according to Dan Siegel, so if this is your brain, right? When you are experiencing big emotions, you're so sad, you're so angry, what happens is you flip your lid, which means that what is really active right now is your downstairs brain. And it's harder for you to reach your upstairs brain in terms of really thinking about what's going on or even talking about it. So it's important to focus on the downstairs brain to help you heal through it in terms of helping you regulate your body, your breathing, and many other body functions. And when that is calmer or more stabilized, then this calms down. You have better access to your upstairs brain. Now you can think about it. Now you can talk about it. You can use language to really talk about your emotions, with a supportive caregiver, even with your friends in your environment. So that's one way by which you could use the hand model of the brain in terms of really thinking about uh, uh, bringing some psychoeducation to kids about the impact of trauma, stress, or even like big emotions on their body and their brain. I think there was a hand raise. Now I know this is a packed agenda, and I'm not sure if there's a way you could put your question in the chat so I could respond to it throughout. Yes, the puppet or glove. I think Amazon sells it. You could just type in hand puppet of the brain or something like that. And many other places would also like sell them. Caitlin, I think your hand was raised. I'll entertain one question right now, but I'm also, of course, cognizant of aware of the time and how much limited time we have. But go ahead, Caitlin. Oh, I think there was already an instruction for you, Caitlin, if you could put your question in the chat and I could try to find a way to respond to it. Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Now, looking at that brain model or hand model of the brain and also the neurodevelopmental uh, uh, phases, right? We could also think about using that to inform the way we use play therapy or therapeutic play, right? In terms, if we are following like a bottom-up approach, that means you could also organize your play therapy activities with kids in a neurodevelopmental sequence. You could start with activities in the brainstem or those that bring balance or stabilization to the brainstem. Movement. I do a lot of like freeze dancing with kids or dancing with music, rhythm, playing with musical instruments, sensory play. Oh, this is something that a lot of kids I work with love so much, using water, using sand, Play-Doh, slime. Sometimes when I run groups, I do like slime parties with them. We make slime together, and there are recipes you could find online on how to make slime. And then that's sensory play, like engaging kids in it as a way to stabilize the brainstem. And then once they're more relaxed and calmer in their bodies, then you could move to activities that are more activating and bringing balance to the limbic system of the brain. This is where you help kids process their emotions using expressive arts. So you could use play therapy, you could use art intervention, creative arts therapies as a way to ask a child to tell their stories using expressive arts, using toys in play therapy, puppets, using miniatures in a sand tray, right? Without your interruption in a verbal way. So many times it's important for a play therapist to sit in silence sometimes, just to witness how a child is really narrating their story, non-verbally, but using expressive arts materials. And then from the limbic system, you move to cortex-based activities. This is where you process things with kids in language form. If they have created something through art intervention on a sheet of paper, then you could ask questions. Can you tell me the story behind your drawing? Who is this? What is this doing? Tell me the story behind it. Now you're moving to the cortex, helping a child process their story of emotions and thoughts and their experiences in the cortex. And you could use here, integrate here trauma-focused CBT, insight-oriented therapies. This is where you have conversations with kids about their thoughts, about their emotions, narrative or storytelling. That's all in the cortex. I mentioned play, and play in working with children really started with the psychoanalytic thinking. And a lot of the proponents of play therapy were psychoanalytic in a way that they viewed play as a way to catch the unconscious of a child. So a lot of the initial play therapy models were very client-centered. You just follow the lead of the child, right? The child takes the lead in really narrating their story to you through play, right? And play therapy in itself is a form of self-healing. So being psychoanalytic, many of the play therapy models in the beginning were about looking at play as really symbolic play, as a way for a child to really symbolize their internal experiences, their unconscious processes, in a way that is externalized or projected into their play. How they tell their stories in the sand, in puppets, using water, in, art intervention on a sheet of paper, right? It's a symbolic way of projecting it to the external world. And that's also a way to explain play to caregivers or parents, right? For adults, a way for us most of the time to process, our emotions or our unconscious processes is to talk about it, to verbalize it, or to write about it in language form. However, developmentally, many kids may not have easy access yet or full access to language in a way that they could really maximize the use of it to really process their difficult emotions, right? So many times, a more valuable way of really helping a child tell their story is through play. And that's important to highlight for parents because sometimes some parents or caregivers may be spectacle, well, you're just playing with my child, but really emphasizing the therapeutic value of play and how that's the language of a child in terms of like processing their experiences. Founders of play therapy and approaches. So these are just a couple of founders of play therapy and the current leaders. I have highlighted like a couple of those that I follow a lot because of their work around trauma responsive play. Eliana Gill, Linda Homeyer, who is famous for Santray therapy, especially using Santray therapy for trauma healing. Paris Goodyear Brown, who created a model called trauma play. And you could also get certified in her model in terms of really a sequential prescriptive approach in following almost a Tri-Phasic model, that same sequence of helping a child through trauma healing. The major approaches of play therapy are often non-directive and directive. So they are located in a spectrum. The initial founders of play therapy were very much non-directive or child-centered or client-centered. And the later postmodern play therapy models became more directive because of their integration with other evidence-based practices. So for example, if you're looking to integrate CBT or cognitive behavior therapy into your work with very young children, you can also look into the work of some experts like Athena Drews, who has blended play therapy with CBT, right? How do you do cognitive restructuring with a child using play, using puppets, right? So there are ways to do that with children. So that is more directive play because in directive play, it's not just following the lead of the child. Many times you structure a play therapy session wherein you have set activities. It's almost like creating a syllabus for your session with a child, with a series of activities that you're going to implement or facilitate with the child in session. Okay. In terms of a typical play therapy session, I would show you like various aspects of it, like throughout the presentation, including like videos. At least you could see how it might look like. So again, I mentioned about Eliana Gill. These are just a couple of her books that you could reference in terms of her work around trauma responsive play. I mentioned about Paris Goodyear Brown, who developed this evidence-based practice known as trauma play that follows a sequence that aligns with Judith Herman's Tri-Phasic Model. Yeah, you start with safety and stabilization, and then emotion regulation work, soothing the physiology before you move to cognitive aspects of the play, and also helping a client process their trauma narrative. With Paris Goodyear Brown, you really view these different play therapy tools as just colors in a palette. Central to the work is really attachment, how you strengthen your bond with a child so they can better engage in the different activities that you bring during your session. Using puppets in play and also play therapy and also in assessment. I mentioned about puppetry. I use puppetry a lot, even in doing assessment with kids. I'll give an example right now of how you could integrate puppetry in your own assessment works. For example, if you're doing a clinical interview with a child, sometimes you might use like some clinical interview tools. With young kids, sometimes I use the puppet sentence completion task. In here, a traditional sentence completion task is where you ask a child to complete sentence stems. My favorite food is, mommy is, daddy is nice when, I am happiest when. It could give like different aspects of their life, but in a version of asking them to complete like sentence stems. You can make that more playful and fun by using puppets. And the way to do it is, you see here a therapist, you would have two puppets on your disposal. Yeah, you choose two puppets for yourself. So I'll give one example, and then we'll go with the first sentence. My favorite food is. If I'm the therapist, I would have two puppets with me. So for example, I have here a finger puppet of a snake, and I have here a hand puppet of uh, a turtle. What you'll do is you will model it first for the child, making your two puppets complete the sentence stem. And then you would ask your child client to also pick a puppet for themselves. And then once you have completed your sentence stems, you would ask the child to also complete it using their puppet. And it would look something like this. So the first one is my favorite food is. My favorite food is, well, sushi. I love sushi. Oh, okay. Well, I'm so shy to talk to you, but well, I'll try because you're my friend. Well, my favorite food is worms. I love worms. How about you? Yes, how about you? And now you direct it to the child, and now using their puppet, the child will also try to complete the sentence. So in that way, you're doing a clinical interview, but in a playfully engaging way of using like puppets. Now, if you're a play therapist or a therapist who might not have puppets yet, in your clinic, there's also a way to use art intervention to, work with a child to create their own hand puppets. You could do it, for example, using socks or brown bags. So in this example, this is via telehealth, not a real client. It's actually one of my children. I asked her to create her puppet using a sock. And in my end, I created a puppet using a brown bag. And then we use this card game, sentence completion play therapy card game. And they are also sentence stems. And we both tried to complete those sentence stems alternately. And it would look something like this.
It's our first card. It says, I'll start first. I love mangoes. How about you?
I I love cats.
Ah, here you go. Here's our next card. It says, my safe place is, and I will do that. My safe place is the beach.
My safe place is my house.
Ah, I like that. This is the next card, and it says, I want to change how long this pandemic is.
I want to change where I live.
Okay. You see there, of course, that was done at the beginning of the pandemics. There are like references around it too. So that's one way you could use like puppetry. And even though you don't have access to like puppets, there are ways you could create them with kids using socks, paper bags, and many other like art materials. As part of assessment of like family functioning, you could even use a playful way of doing genograms with kids. Monica McGoldrick, who's famous for her work around creating genograms in family assessment with, circles, squares, and lines, to capture family dynamics and relationships, even intergenerationally, right? With kids, that may not be the most engaging, but you could do it also in a playful way using miniatures. The miniatures that you often use in like Sandtray therapy could also be used in genogram form. And you could do something like this with kids and families, right? You could ask the family to sit around on the ground if they are able to, put a sheet of paper on the ground, and then you draw circles, and then each circle represents each family member. And then you just ask each family member to go around, they pick a miniature that they think, or their choice of a miniature that might represent themselves and each family member. And then they would put it here. So for example, here's a circle for mom. Mom picks a miniature that she feels represents herself. And then all the other family members. So for example, if there's a dad in the family, there are kids in the family, each of them would also pick a miniature to represent mom, right? And then you go around doing that. And after that, I just have a conversation with the family around what made them choose certain miniatures to represent like family members. And sometimes it could be a fun, sometimes it could even lead like to conflicts, sometimes a conflictual conversation with families around it, like, why did you pick that to represent me? I remember working with a grandma who was the legal guardian of like three kids at one time. And then two of the boys, 7 and 9, picked a T-Rex dinosaur to represent grandma. And grandma was like so appalled by it, like, I'm no T-Rex. And then the two boys, I know they were just pulling her leg, but grandma, you're strong like a dinosaur, you always protect us, when people are mean to us, you yell at them, you growl at them, just like a dinosaur. Of course, for me, it's a fun way, but sometimes it could lead to, of course, difficult conversations that you would also need to navigate with the family. And here's another example with telehealth. If kids don't have like a sand tray and miniatures at their disposal, you could just ask them to direct it for you. Orient them on the miniatures that you have, and then ask them to pick miniatures to represent their family members. And it could look something like this.
Oh, right next to you. Okay. Now, who else is in your family?
My mom and my dad.
Okay. Who would you want to be your mom?
The cheetah and my dad is the tiger.
Okay. Where would you want me to put mom cheetah?
Next to sister, and then dad should be right next to mom, and then my two cats.
Your two cats. Now, with your two cats, what miniature? I don't have cats, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But is there
Yeah.
any? Is there any miniature? Oh, seals. Yeah, I have seals. I have two seals. There you go.
Okay, that video is just very quick. But there you could see that I'm asking the child to really pick miniatures to represent family members, but I also direct them to let me know where should I put them. And sometimes that could lead to conversations about attachment, like how close or how distant a child feels with certain family members. And that could also be part of your understand, highlighting and also helping you better understand how close or how distant relationships are within the family, right? Now, you could also use, like, of course, if you're doing like telehealth, or even if you're seeing clients in person, you could pull an iPad or a computer and use an online Sandtray version from Dr. Karen Fried. If you go to Oaklander Training, and let me see if I could put all the links in the chat for all the resources I will be sharing today. Yes, there you go. There's a link there to Oaklander Training. And Oaklander Training is great. During the beginning of the pandemic, they came up with tools and resources that are available in the public domain. Online Sandtray, online dollhouse, online puppets. So I talked about puppetry a while back. If you click on that online puppets, you could do online puppet play with clients. You click on a puppet from here and, oops, give me a second. It's not working. There you go. And it would appear here. Oh, now I have two frogs. And then you could make them speak to each other. You could use like buttons to make them talk to each other in a digital way. And then one that I would show you right now is the sand tray here. So you could even use, but these are images. So you could ask a child to pick like images to represent family members. They could pick, mythical objects. They could pick like animals to represent family members and themselves. And there you could have like a family portrait, a family genogram using like images. So, you could use those tools as well. Digital, when you're thinking about digital play therapy, really leveraging technology to do play therapy with kids. Now, one model I also want to share, I know there was a lot of questions in the chat too around different models of doing like play and therapy. Now, my recommendation is, of course, find ways to integrate it in a way that they follow a good sequence of really intervention with the child. So they don't just feel like a hodgepodge of different interventions that you're doing. For me, at least, I try to be informed by sequentially planned integrative models. So for example, this one by Geldard shows a sequence of working with children wherein phase one could be very much non-directive, child-centered. Just allow the child to explore the play therapy room and tell their story on their own terms, in terms of where they want to start. And you're just there to really follow their lead as they tell their story. And then gradually you could move to like phase two, which is Gestalt therapy. Sometimes kids, once they get to parts of their story wherein it might be too painful or too hard for them to really process, even in their play, like experiences of trauma, experiences of anger or conflict, right? Then you would see some resistance in children. Sometimes you might use like Gestalt play therapy as a way to help clients understand that that's part of themselves. Like all the anger is really part of themselves. And you could do like play therapy interventions to reinforce that. And then as a child gets used to really holding difficult parts of their story, you could use narrative therapy to further ask them to really take the lead in authoring their story, like what comes next in their story, what can happen next in their story, right? So you could use narrative therapy as part of that intervention. And then if there are certain symptoms, behaviors, thoughts that might benefit from coping skills for a child, you might integrate as part of phase 4 cognitive behavior therapy to coach kids on certain skills they could do. Like if certain thoughts are making them experience certain emotions, then you could do cognitive restructuring for them, using CBT. And if there are certain behaviors that you would help them change, with of course the support of their caregivers or even their teachers, you might put like behavior therapy as like phase 5. So this is just one example of like a sequence you could do. And if you're integrating different like models of interventions like child-centered play therapy, parent-child interaction therapy, it just shows in this slide like the sequence by which you could integrate aspects of those different evidence-based practices into this sequence. There was a question a while back of what does a play therapy session look like? Here's an example of phase 1, where you're using a model like child-centered play therapy, wherein you're just following the lead of the child. Now, I won't recommend that you would design your room in this way, where it's just in this array. This was just made for role-playing purposes. I think this was done probably in a classroom setting. But I just want you to pay attention a little bit on some of the elements of really doing like child-centered play therapy, of just following the lead of the child as they are engaging in play materials.
What do you like? What's that?
Thinking about what that might be.
He asks what it is, and rather than responding, "It's a straw," I empower him to label the object by saying, "You're wondering what that might be."
And here it could be anything you want it to be.
It's like airplane. It's an airplane.
You've decided that's an airplane. Both of them. You're looking at me, you're wondering something. Holding it up to your mouth. See what it feels like.
What was it?
Oh, you've offered some to me. All right. What do you want me to do?
To eat that.
You want me to eat?
Sometimes when asked to play by a child, we use a stage whisper where we ask something like, "What should I do next?" just to empower the child to still be directing the play.
All right, it's just a quick video. And if you type in, even in YouTube, like child-centered play therapy, you would find more videos there that would really model how most of the time you're just tracking, describing what the child is doing, reflecting feelings as they come. Like when a child, expresses certain emotions, just reflect it back. Oh yeah, that dragon seems really angry in your story, right? And returning the responsibility to the child always to direct their play. So if the child asks you, what should I do next? What do you think can you do next? Just return the responsibility of the child and just offer them choices in the room. Well, you can do this. Some kids I work with would also try to explore or tell their story using the sand or the puppets. You could give them choices, but ultimately return the responsibility of the child and you would just follow their lead. Now, that version of child-centered play therapy could also be done in a way that you coach parents or caregivers to also be very child-centered in the way they play with their children at home. And there's a model for that. It's called filial play therapy or child-parent relationship therapy, wherein you coach or teach parents to be their own play therapists with their children. And that's a way to really follow the lead of the child. So the child feels more attached with the parent in a way that they feel validated in their experience because they know that a parent or a caregiver is spending time with them, but allowing them to have better control of telling their story. This is just a fun example from, I think I got this from TikTok a while back, in terms of following the child's lead. I'll just share this as almost like a mindful break of just watch the video and then just be attuned to how this caregiver is just following the child's lead.
Buddy photos.
All right. I just thought it was fun to show, just in terms of, a parent who really takes the time to just follow the lead of a child in terms of like play therapy, right? I think there was a question a while back, just also in terms of child parent psychotherapy, which, if you're thinking about working with the 0 to 5 population, very impactful, and it has also shown good evidence in research, just in terms of really impacting one's neurobiology, in terms of change that could happen in the body based on adverse childhood experiences. I would recommend looking at the work of child parent psychotherapy, or CPP. It's a dyadic model. So the way of doing like play therapy here to help a client or a young child tell their story around trauma through play is with the participation of a caregiving adult. So it's dyadic. That means you see a parent or a caregiver and their child together throughout the therapy sessions, in terms of, allowing them to play together some of the trauma exposures of the child. Now, in terms of using toys, if you go to the Child Parent Psychotherapy website, also their YouTube channel, you would find there some modeling or an overview of their model. And also there was a really nice video there from Chandra Ghosh Ipin, who is one of the consultants and trainers of child parent psychotherapy, in terms about how do you talk about play with parents or caregivers and the power of using toys to really help a child tell their story.
So one of the things that I like to do is I like to show parents, to show aunts and uncles, grandparents, foster parents, whoever I'm working with, what's in the toy bag. I like to pack it with them so that we can think together about what it'll be like to have these objects in the room. And we can think together about not how the kid is going to play with them, but what they might do given what we both know about their history. And that really kind of clues us in as caregivers to kind of, if a child who's been hungry starts picking up the food toys and playing with them, we become more alert. We think, oh, this might really have a deeper meaning. And we do what I say, we lean in. Because otherwise, if we're not alert to that, what we tend to do is to just be like, oh, they're just playing. What is the possible meaning of this? One of the things that's really important to know, though, is that children often cloak their play in mystery. And so I'm just going to push some of these out of the way. I'm going to use the people toys for this. And let me just pull out a family. So I've laid out a family, and we work with all different kinds of families. But here what I've chosen is a mom and a dad who sometimes have really not gotten along well and have fought, and the kids have seen it, right? And so if we would imagine that they're fighting. But one thing that might be really confusing is, what if the little boy depicts himself as a fireman, right? So he's not being so kind to us as picking the doll that would be appropriate for his size. And so he's got the fireman, and then he's also showing a baby, and there is no baby in the family. And so they sometimes cloak their play in a little bit of mystery. And sometimes when things happen in the family, and they're showing fighting, they might show that actually a lion has come in. And a lion is coming in and harming people and destroying the whole family. And I'm doing kind of something that a kid might do. And of course, there's been no lion. Now, we as therapists, we might understand, oh, the child is showing us that sometimes people get sort of tossed about by anger. In a way, the lion is a symbol of anger. We don't really know. We want to remain curious, right? But if I'm a parent and I'm not a trained child therapist, it could be super confusing because, like, look, there's a fireman who's not my kid, there's an extra baby, and there's a lion who's destroying the house. This is part of our role. I sometimes think about how I speak play, and play is a particular language, kind of like I speak Spanish. And when I'm working with somebody who may not speak play, it's important for me to think with them about what might be the meaning of what the child is saying because they're speaking another language. And play is a super complex language because it often has multiple meanings. So we as grown-ups, we tend to think really linearly, and we tend to think about how a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And actually that's something that we're socialized into when we start going to school, is to tell our stories that way. But children often tell stories about things were dangerous. Oh my goodness, things were dangerous. And all of a sudden, right, then the police came and brrr, and people went away. And when they went away, it felt like they were being tossed, right? It felt like things were happening. And it's really hard and chaotic to understand what they're doing if someone's, not helping them. And it can be really actually hard for us to understand. And it would be a real miss to say, I really know exactly what's happening here. And this is where reflective supervision comes in, where it would be really useful to kind of think about later on, what is it that the child was doing and how is it that we might understand this? Because next week when the kid comes in, often we see a really similar scene. And it's helpful to think about what might the possible meanings be given what the caregiver has shared with us. So we can then, when it happens again, we can say, wow, there's a lot of fighting happening, and then people are not together again, and it's so scary. And as those words come out of us, sometimes the caregivers, look at us, and they know that that's exactly what happened in their family. Not as a beginning, middle, and an end, but as an entirety. And it's really shocking to see these very tiny beings are struggling with making meaning of all of these things that have happened.
Again, there was a question a while back, I think in the chat, around working with kids under 5. And definitely you could look into models like child-parent psychotherapy as a way to really encourage a child with the support of their caregiver in using play to tell their story. And if you're following the neurosequential approach, right, the play in itself is really helping them regulate in their emotions and in their body. And then, in a developmentally appropriate way, helping the child put words into their experience by, as what you've seen from Chandra, like just describing like, oh my God, the world is just so dangerous right now. It's so scary with everybody around you, sometimes so angry, right? As a way to appeal to that reason with a child. So helping them reach that sense or that stage of being able to use words to really capture their experiences. Now, what I'll share now, given the time as well, like limitations, is to think about the stages of trauma recovery. I'm just going to share like a couple of tools you could think about to integrate into play using play therapy that focus on safety and stabilization and later on trauma narrative processing. With safety and stabilization, helping your clients become more regulated in their brainstem. You could use a variety of like somatic management tools, breathing retraining, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness, movement-based, yoga, tai chi. And many times as part of psychoeducation, you could use bibliotherapy to introduce kids to some of the concepts that are more abstract, like mindfulness. You could use books like What Does It Mean to Be Present? I Am at Peace as a good introduction to young kids around like mindfulness. With progressive muscle relaxation, and this came from trauma-focused CBT, finding ways to make it more playful with a child, right? Using, for example, visualization to help them think or visualize ways to relax different parts of their body, but thinking of like images. For example, in helping them tense and relax their hand muscles, instead of just, verbally prompting them to do that, you could ask children to pretend that they are squeezing lemons. And then sometimes I would even give them like squishies, right? As a way to like squeeze those lemons, as a way to tense those hand muscles. And now I want you to release that lemon as a way to, simulate the relaxation. Now you feel your hands more relaxed as you've released that lemon, right? And you could do other visualizations for that as well. If you're looking for, the exact handout on how to make a progressive muscle relaxation more playful that way, I put in the chat the link to my website, which is called the Tools to Improve Practice website. There are many sections there of therapeutic tools you could integrate into your work. I mentioned about progressive muscle relaxation. You would find that in the CBT Informed section. And in here, there's a section there on feeling calm and a couple of resources there on how to help kids and also teenagers around breathing retraining using, for example, imagery, right, as a playful way to engage them in breathing. Here's an example of how to do that. Here's an example of like rainbow breathing.
All right, let's start. So I want us to breathe in the first color, which is red. And as you breathe in red, just imagine there's red. Fill up your body with red from your head to your toes and breathe out all your worries and anger and sadness or anything negative. Now let's fill in our body with the second color. Now we go to orange. Breathe in orange. Fill up your body with orange from your head down to your toes.
All right. So you get an example. I'm just showing that because especially with young children, and I think some of you also mentioned like working with kids who might have ADHD or ADHD-like symptoms, right? A very engaging way to really anchor them, especially in somatic management activities, is to not just do a verbal prompt, right? Sometimes it might mean catching their attention and focus better by having like a lot of images that you bring to help them like visualize and anchor them in the moment. With Mai, for example, given her heritage, and she talked about, some of the stories her grandma used to tell her about the history of the Vietnamese people as coming from a dragon and a fairy. I looked into culturally attuned ways of really bringing some of her stories and integrating them into treatments. For example, in breathing exercises, I found dragon breathing exercises for her, right? And you could find that, again, in the TIPS website. There are breathing imagery exercises there. And the one I showed you on rainbow breathing, it's in this worksheet from Monkinia. And you would find there the dragon breathing, rainbow breathing. And if you're doing telehealth, similar to what I'm doing with you right now, you could just screen share it. Or if you're doing in-person work, you could print it out. And that could be your anchor with kids in terms of walking them through like a breathing exercise. With progressive muscle relaxation, I mentioned PMR for children. You could use this picture board with instructions and prompts on what stories you would read behind them to help kids relax and tense their muscles. Okay. Let me just move this slide a little bit to the next one. So also I'm thinking about time. So let me just show you like a couple of other things you could think about. You think about somatic management, and I've learned this as well from models like dialectical behavior therapy, right? Soothing the senses as part of the stress tolerance. So kids and youth can better tolerate like big emotions, right? You could help them put together like a soothing box with objects in that soothing box that could help them soothe their various senses. It could be a favorite book. It could be a picture of their family or a picture of a favorite activity to soothe their visual sense. It could be a favorite smell, lavender, a favorite perfume or syrup that, has a certain smell for them, right? Or things that could be soothing for their sense of touch, Play-Doh, slime, a squishy, things like that. You could put different things there. And the idea is that when a child feels big emotions, you could, as a way to distract them from those big emotions, right? You could ask them to engage in objects in their soothing box. Sometimes you could make it fun with kids too. Sometimes I play games with them like scavenger hunt if they're in their homes. Scavenger hunt of objects they can put in their soothing box. And that could be, a full session activity. And then walking them through how they could use objects there in their soothing box to help them regulate their body and emotions better. Then other things you could do around somatic management. Let me share another one. This one was from a play therapist, Tammy Van Hollander. You could also follow her work. She's very rich in resources around play therapy and expressive arts therapy. You could engage kids in nature bracelets. So in here, you could do a nature walk, a mindful nature walk with them. And as they're paying attention to their environment, they pick objects that are soothing to their various senses. It may be a beautiful flower that is soothing to their sense of sight. It could be a lavender that is soothing for their sense of smell. It could be a small pebble that is soothing for their sense of touch. And then what they do is you place a masking tape around their wrist, sticky side up, then go for a mindful walk, and then they tape those objects to their nature bracelet. Now, once they have it after the mindful walk, they can put that in their soothing box. And then they can engage with it when they need it as part of their soothing box. I'm also big now in leveraging technology aside from, like, of course, telehealth options, right? The use of AI. You could definitely use AI a lot with kids to create, through AI image generation tools to create safe images for them that are soothing for them to remember what a safe place looks like after you have facilitated with them like a safe place visualization, right? You could definitely use OpenAI to customize a visualization prompt for a child based on their interests. Here's an example. I was working with a Native American boy, and then we customized his safe place visualization prompt based on his Cherokee background. And then also after that, I use like AI generation tools like DALL-E or like Bing image generator to recreate that safe place. If a child, of course, doesn't want to engage in art intervention to just draw it or express it on paper, you could use AI to generate that safe place, print it out, and they could take it home as like a reminder of, if they're getting distress, to go back to their safe place based on the visualization exercise that you did with them. Okay. Definitely with mindfulness, I use a lot of YouTube channels and videos with kids. Here are just a couple of recommendations. So instead of you just reading prompts, auditory prompts to kids, it's more engaging to watch a video with them and do the mindfulness activity with them, or engage them in choosing YouTube channels or videos on mindfulness. You could do that as well with kids. So I would highly recommend that as well. Okay. Let me just highlight a couple more around like emotion regulation. Your use of like feeling charts, according to Dan Siegel, name it to tame it, right? And so being playful and creative in even ways you research for, feeling charts with kids, sometimes based on their interests. I was working with a child who loves One Piece, and then we found like Monkey D. Luffy feeling faces, right? If you're using like zones of regulation, right? Helping a child, categorize their emotions based on colors. Like I'm in the blue zone, the green zone, the yellow zone, or the red zone. Here's just an example wherein I was working with a client who loves Avatar. So we use Avatar characters to represent each of those zones of regulation. You could use sand trays to help clients represent their emotions or feelings, right? You could ask a child to create an anger picture or create a world that represents sadness, right? And they could use miniatures to represent that in the sand. No conversation around emotions with kids would fly without me integrating Inside Out. I think for me, of course, it's Disney and Pixar, but what led from that movie was a lot of materials you could use in emotion regulation work. Even in YouTube, you could find like games on Inside Out to help kids name emotions and understand what they mean, right? And then there are even tools that you could easily Google that you could use in psychoeducation around emotions. Like for this one, it gives you, based on the universal emotions, if they overlap, it can lead to complex emotions, like sadness and disgust could be self-loathing, right? Disgust and fear could be revulsion, and especially for older kids, if they're trying to increase their emotional literacy using like bigger emotions, you could also look into that. One of my favorite play tools with kids is this one, nesting dolls. I work with a lot of kids who oftentimes they struggle with anger. And we talk about anger, like, what does it mean? Are you really angry? Or is there something else underneath that anger? And often what I found with many kids I work with, right, they have anger as a protective shell because it's easier to be angry. And sometimes some kids don't feel they're entitled to joy. So they'd rather be angry. Or sometimes there's a lot of sadness they want to cover up because they'd rather be angry. It's often perceived as a stronger emotion rather than admitting that I'm sad. And with my my client, she often expresses her grief through anger. And probably she's in that stage too of really grieving. But at the same time, she had a hard time like acknowledging her sadness. She'd rather be angry than sad. Or some clients, especially those who are trauma exposed, may have feelings of disgust about their body, about their experiences, that they'd rather be angry than disgusted. Or for many trauma exposed kids who have a lot of fear and their world is very like scary, here's fear. Oops, sorry, I'm not sure if you could see that, right? Yeah. They'd rather be angry. So for me, that could be a playful way of engaging kids in conversations about primary versus secondary emotion. That underneath the anger, what's the story there? Right? And it's a wonderful way of even bringing it to young kids because sometimes that idea of like primary versus secondary emotion can be too abstract with kids, but there are ways to bridge that using play materials. Here are just a couple examples asking kids to create sand stories of their different like emotions. So you could also do that with kids. Okay, let me go to another way you could think about. Let's see. Let me share this one too before I move to trauma narrative processing. When you're working with cognitive coping, of course, cognitive coping often, informed by models like CBT. You could bring CBT even for younger kids. I've used CBT for young kids as early as like 3 or 4, but you find ways to make it like more playful. Definitely follow the work of Athena Drews. I would also recommend looking into the work of like Liana Lewinstein as a way to integrate CBT or use play therapy in CBT work. So for example, this one, when you are doing psychoeducation around the CBT triangle of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, sometimes instead of like a worksheet on the triangle, I would just use like a puppet. And here's a puppet that was shared by some play therapists on what you could do around CBT psychoeducation. It's a three-headed dragon, and each head represents those sides of the CBT triangle, right? The feeling dragon, the thinking dragon, and the acting dragon or the behaving dragon. And you could use this as a playful way to show kids that they are interrelated. Like sometimes our emotions and thoughts or our thoughts lead to how we are feeling certain things. Like if we think that nobody loves me, then I would feel really sad about it. And in terms of my behavior, I'd run away. I'd go into my room to cry. So that could be like a playful way of really teaching the CBD triangle, not using a worksheet, which could sometimes with kids could be a reminder of like school, right? But in a playful way using that puppet, right? And of course, other metaphors you could use, like a CBT baseball, again, following the work of Athena Drews. Here's an example from Liana Lewinstein. Let me just show this quick video of how she would do it in a play therapy way by asking a child to move around. And this is with her daughter.
We're going to play the helpful thoughts game to help us learn how unhelpful thoughts can make us feel worse and have a negative effect on what we do, and how helpful thoughts can help us cope better with situations. I'd like you to pick an unhelpful thoughts card. That's the blue deck of cards. So pick the top card from the blue deck of cards and read the situation out loud.
You wake up from a scary dream.
Okay, now stand at the top corner of the triangle where it says thoughts. So the situation is you wake up from a scary dream. Now read what it says for the unhelpful thought.
The monster is going to eat me.
Okay, so you're thinking to yourself, you wake up from a scary dream and your thought is, the monster's going to eat me. Now hop on your left foot to where it says feelings. And read what your feelings would be in this situation.
Scared and unsafe.
Scared and unsafe. Now hop on over to behaviors.
Okay,
And then
you get the point. So there's a playful way by which you could even ask a child to walk around the CBT triangle and represent their experiences by going through the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. If your kids that you work with are very savvy with apps, you could use this app from Trauma Focused CBT, the Triangle of Life, as a way to walk clients through a story as part of psychoeducation around that distinction among thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And here's an example.
Okay, I wonder what line we'll do now next.
That up ahead. Try tapping it to see what it does.
Oh, okay. I was lonely. Do you think that's a thought, a feeling, or a behavior?
Feeling.
A feeling, very good.
Okay, so you get the point. You could walk them to different stories, and it gets them to the idea of really being more insightful around, oh, that's a thought, oh, that's a behavior, or that's an emotion. And then you would bring it now to their experience. Another playful way of thinking about, cognitive restructuring is how you introduce like thinking in a playful way. You could use the metaphor of like ants, automatic negative thoughts. And if you Google, there are links in the slide on where you could use like metaphors of ants to capture different cognitive errors that you could have conversations with kids. In the UK, instead of ants, they use knots. And there's even like an app for that. I think it's a paid app though, but it's a CBT based way of introducing gnats or negative automatic thoughts to kids and finding or teaching them skills to replace or challenge those negative thoughts. And I will show you a quick video from Liana Lewinstein and also Paris Goodyear Brown, who is the proponent of trauma play, in terms of how you could help a child with cognitive restructuring, but in a playful way using this one.
So, you want to try it? Okay, yeah. Okay, so you're going to say the negative self-talk statement before you throw the ball. So I have enough time to actually defend. And I'm going to say the positive restructured statements after that.
Okay,
So
so I'm like the therapist and you're going to be the
And
child.
I'm the child.
Okay, so here we go. I'm stupid. I'm good at math. I'm stupid. I'm good at soccer. I'm stupid. I'm good at hugging my brother.
So in this modification for anxiety, we would be looking at the child's negative self-talk in terms of what are the irrational worried thoughts that plague that child, and then we would come up with some replacement statements. And so, or boss back talk. With anxiety, you might call it boss back talk with the child. So if it's a perfectionistic child who says, I have to make 100 on the test, then I might say, I'll do the best I can, or I'll try hard, or I might make 100. Just the difference between I might make 100 and I must make 100 changes the pressure for the child.
Okay, let's try it.
Okay. So you say, I've got to make 100 on the test.
I have to get 100 on the test.
I'll do the best I can.
I have to get 100.
I might get 100.
I have to get 100.
Nobody's perfect. If you're working with traumatized children who have lies that they were perhaps told by the perpetrator that they have believed now to be true, you can begin to wrestle with those lies in 3 dimensions with the lose the bruise activity. So if the perpetrator, if the child now believes it's my fault, then you can simply say, it's my fault, throw the balls, and then I would be saying, it's not my fault, it's his fault, in response.
It's all my fault.
It's not my fault.
It's all my fault.
I didn't do anything wrong.
It's all my fault.
It's his fault. Right? So you boss it back. And really, I've been amazed at the way getting the full body involved, and they can feel themselves defending against the negative self-talk, empowered.
I've been amazed with that as well. And you could see there, even with very young kids, that's an example of doing it in 3 dimensions in a play therapy way of a thought record. Instead of a worksheet for them to write, ways to challenge their automatic negative thoughts, do it in a playfully engaging way that is 3-dimensional. And that's one example of how to do it. And now I also know, just for the sake of time, I would move into just for 5 minutes, and before we could go into a few minutes of like Q&A, just the trauma narrative processing piece. When you process trauma, remember that there are various ways by which you could really help kids tell their stories, not just verbally. So for example, when Dr. Dolores Bigfoot was working with American Indian, Alaska Native children and families, and she was finding ways to culturally adapt trauma-focused CBT, the way to tell stories might not necessarily be asking a child to talk about it or write about it, but you could integrate, expressive arts, like in the Native American tradition, using journey sticks or sand stories to help clients tell their trauma story. And of course, in play therapy, you could find ways to be more creative in asking kids to tell their stories through sand memory books, graphic novels, right? Music, visual arts, timelines like journey sticks or puppetry to tell their stories. And sometimes to get kids to storytelling, you might model it for them initially by engaging in bibliotherapy, right? You read books together about stories that might resonate better with them. I would recommend exploring some of the bibliotherapeutic books from Piplo Productions, which is also based or aligned with the work of child parent psychotherapy, because a lot of them are stories of anxiety, of trauma exposure, of stress, disasters, the pandemic, etc., that you could use. And many of them are free as in PDF and in different languages. And they have mental health therapy tools that you could print out and use with kids that you work with that support or supplement the storytelling aspect of it. So, for example, once I was very scared, talks about stressful events and how different animals in the jungle might have different feelings around those events. And then it has a feeling chart that go with it, available in English and Spanish. In Japan, for example, they use manga as a way to encourage kids to tell their stories about anxiety or even trauma or even like depression or like sadness from the work of Yoshiko Okayama. Definitely for me, and an example I would give from my work with Mai, I have used Santre therapy with her to really help her process her difficult stories, especially around like trauma. Now, Santre therapy is also very culturally responsive, especially in your choice of different miniatures, making sure that you really bring, a lot of miniatures that a client can choose from to represent their stories, right? And sometimes you arrange your Santre room in a way that it's organized in different, with different categories of like people, objects from mythology, culture, different cultural objects, etc. And often to organize your Santre therapy room, there's a link there in your slide on if you're to have a shopping list of what are the most important ways or objects or miniatures you could include in your Santre therapy work. I also do community mental health. So if you don't have access to a Santre room, just use like a shoebox to be the Santre, and that's more mobile too if you're doing like community mental health, doing therapy in the homes of your clients, and then have at your disposal a few miniatures to encourage clients to tell their story. Now, storytelling around Santre, of course, follows that neurodevelopmental pattern as well, right? You start the client with touching the sand. That is really brainstem work. And then the narrative element allow them to tell the story in the sand. That's limbic area work with you just quietly observing their storytelling. And then the conversational part that goes into the cortex, wherein you ask questions. So we'll ask them to create their world. And then after that, towards the end of a session, then walk them through some questions around their Santre. If you are non-directive as a therapist, often the prompt is just ask them to create their world. But if you're more directive, you could have like prompts that more align with issues that your child clients are going through. Tell me the story of your parents or caregiver's divorce in the sense, or your fight with that bully in school and what happened. Tell that story in the sense. And then later on, you could ask them questions when you're now moving into the cortex to ask them to tell you what was the story and processing it with them. So, asking questions like, what's the title of this story? What is happening in here? Are you in this story? Right? Where is the power in this story? Right? You could find ways of asking questions to now go to the cortex, appealing to the reason to ask a client to tell their story. Here's the Santre of Mai in helping her tell her story. Consistently, she would tell her story by creating two islands, a big island and a small island. In the big island, she would tell her stories of stress, but the ones wherein she has a better handle of and she's willing to share, right? Difficulties in school, being withdrawn, sometimes feeling like a small child because she doesn't have the skills to really relate well with her peers, or sometimes getting into conflicts with her mom, but also thinking that my mom is my strength, right? So she talks a lot about that. And then she has a small island here wherein, for me, especially in the beginning, I felt this is where she put a lot of her trauma exposures around the death of grandma, around witnessing intimate partner violence with her parents. And she wouldn't when we got to the point of the session wherein I would ask her, can you tell me what's going on in here? She would say often, I would not like to talk about that. No, I don't want to talk about it. However, after about 2 months of this consistently bringing this sand tray story, there was a time wherein she would put rocks between the two islands. And for me, that was psychoanalytically rich in terms of, is this potentially a way of her that she's trying to tell me that she's now beginning to bridge what's in her consciousness versus what's in her unconscious, and she's willing to bring out some of it. And I would be consistent in asking her questions, tell me what's going on in here. And then after 2 months, when I asked her one time, can you tell me what's going on in here? And she was ready to tell that story. She talked about death of grandma. She talked about how scary it was to witness her parents fight almost like every night. And that was part of the trauma narrative processing. Definitely, if you are more a psychoanalytic therapist, often interpretation doesn't happen with the client. But if you want to integrate like interpretation in your work with clients, you could follow the work of Violet Oaklander. And I know a lot of her work has also been influenced by Adlerian therapy, which means you help clients through play process their internal processes, but co-interpret it with the client as well. And that's what she calls like a projective process, right? So ask a client first to imagine what they want to tell us a story, and then they make it either in sand, using art materials, using puppets, using objects in water play, etc., or whatever play therapy material they could use to express that story. And then when you're asking them questions like, are you in this story? Sometimes a client might tell you that, yeah, I'm that scared kitten over there in my story. Then ask them to engage in this projective process of owning that symbolization. Like, I am that scared kitten, right? And then having a conversation with them about, does it fit you? When you're out in the world, where you're in your school, in your home, can you tell me times when you felt like a scared kitten, right? And just to explore with them that fit of that metaphor or symbolization. And then, of course, there's an action step of what can you do about it, right? Can you help the kitten be less scared, right? What can we do? And that's where you would coach the child or facilitate a conversation with them, almost like problem solving. Like, what can you do with that metaphor? So that's just one example of how you could use the projective process to really process the story with the child. So I'm also aware I have 5 minutes left, so I'll just skip towards the end in terms of thinking about if you are looking for viable options as well for doing like sand tray therapy. Definitely I would recommend like virtual sand tray therapy options. This is from the work of Jessica Stone, or simply sand play. It's a little bit more cost efficient. It's not too expensive, especially if you're looking at a virtual option for using sand tray with kids. You could go to simply sand play. And of course, there's the free version from Oaklander Training. I think one of you put the link in the chat as well for that, on the platform by Dr. Karen Fried for doing like sand tray therapy. All right, before we launch into just a very quick Q&A, as much as I can answer, I would just reinforce that I shared a lot of tools with you today. And many times it's a good question to ask, where do I start, right? Again, hopefully you could anchor the way you organize your interventions within a trauma-informed model, like Bruce Perry's 3 R's model. Organize activities first that help a client regulate their brainstem, their body, before you move into emotional processing in the limbic system to help them relate better. And then before you move into cortex-based activities, appealing to reason. Now, in my website, there's actually a whole section there on expressive therapies. And for some of you, I think there were some of you who said, where do I start if I want to integrate play therapy into my work? I would recommend reviewing that section. It gives you different models of play therapy, child-centered, trauma-informed, trauma-focused ones, including the work of Liana Lewenstein around integration with CBT, etc., that you could start with. And there's also a section there on trauma healing. I organized that page based on Judith Herman's model of really thinking about safety and stabilization first before you move into trauma stories processing, and various models or interventions, evidence-based practices you could use to support trauma narrative processing with kids. All right, I'll stop there. And let's see, just in like 5 minutes, if there are questions I could address.
There are certainly a lot of questions, Dr. Rubio. So before we try to attempt to answer some of those, I do want to say thank you. Obviously, as always, wonderful and informative presentation and very practical too, I will say that. So again, for folks, we're definitely not going to be able to get through all the questions. I do just encourage you when you fill out the survey, just to add any topics that you're still interested, as we can maybe then try to reach out again to Dr. Rubio, or potentially to have other folks to address some of those concerns. So very quickly, Dr. Rubio, some of the comments that came in earlier as we were opening up, it's folks who are saying, I'm not registered, I'm not certified, I am doing play therapy. Specific questions came in about, do you need to become registered or certified, or is it more about, just pulling some of these practices into work? So any recommendations around that?
I would recommend the latter, right? Especially if you're one who are more integrative in your work and really finding ways to use evidence-based practice in a more playful way. You definitely don't need to be registered as a play therapist to do that. However, of course, I would recommend if you are seeing your career as really moving to really being a full-time like play therapist, definitely a certification would really anchor you in evidence-based treatments and practices around like play therapy. And I think being certified as well would also, of course, improve referrals to you as a certified like play therapist. But definitely, of course, like for many of us, I'm a child psychologist. I'm not a registered play therapist in the US. I am in the UK. But for most of my work, I have really integrated play, even without certification, into the work that I do. Hopefully
Great.
that's
Yeah, no, absolutely. Other questions came in about unique considerations. So primarily for youth who are diagnosed, let's say, with ADHD, or have issues with sensory, just overall, right? How do we get them to engage when there are some things that we need to consider? Maybe they're nonverbal. Anything that you can maybe share with folks? Any sort of suggestions?
That's great. And also that's a big spectrum. I think just pay attention or be attuned to the window of tolerance of a child, right? So for me, especially in working with ADHD, I remember, like thinking about like sessions. Is it really a 50-minute session that is really helpful for a child? Or is it two 20-minute sessions twice a week, right? To really focus their attention. And a lot of times too, really creating a structure could really benefit a lot of kids who have ADHD or have more like sensory processing uh, presentations, right? In terms of really creating, different activities that are sequence. So it can appear like fast paced, but it keeps the child engaged all throughout. And definitely, I gave recommendations all throughout in terms of like integrating visuals, right? So it's not just verbal prompting to really keep the child engaged throughout that time. In terms of sensory processing, again, thinking about that window of tolerance, what can a child integrate? Sometimes in terms of even organizing your play therapy room, if it's too overwhelming for a child, sensory wise, to have the whole entrance to like a play therapy room, bring them to a room that is more blank, and then you bring their materials like in sequence for a child so they don't get overwhelmed in their sensory, as they're engaging in those different materials.
Okay, so working off the baseline. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then very last, a couple of questions of who is, if they play therapy may be less effective with, and at the same time, when does play just become sort of play, right? And it sort of loses that focus that you want as a mental health provider.
Yeah. I think it's always good to ask the question like the therapeutic value of it, right? And sometimes you might assume it, but it's also good to ask the child, like, in this play that we are doing together, what's the impact on you? How are you feeling? How is this helpful for you? And sometimes you may be amazed at what kids tell you, right? I'm playing basketball with you because, yeah, and this is very helpful for me. Nobody plays, no caregiving adult even plays basketball with me. And sometimes as an adult, we may just look at that as we are just playing. Is this really therapeutic? But sometimes a kid or a child can voice to you the importance of that time of playfully engaging with you.
Great. Dr. Rubio, I'm wondering if you could just potentially maybe bring the slides back up as we close out.
Of course.
I do want to just highlight some of our other offerings that we have coming up. But before we do that, I did see that there were some issues with the survey. It seems like it is now working. So again, apologies, we weren't able to answer the questions. We have had Dr. Rubio join us for a few times. So please fill out the survey. Let us know any continued topics of interest, and we will certainly try to attend to those. As we close out, I do want to highlight some of our upcoming events in February around treating family conflict and coercion. As well as an offering on microaggressions. So we at CTAC created a video really looking at the impact of microaggressions, and we're going to build on that during the webinar and discuss microaggressions that occur within the therapeutic space. So again, I do encourage you to join. And on our very last slide, as we do close out, I want to say again, a huge thank you to Dr. Rubio. And of course, to you, our audience members, for attending our webinar today. Again, the survey link was shared with you. Please fill it out. We encourage you to visit our website, ctechny.org, to access past trainings. And as a reminder, the recording and the slides will be up on our website within 2 to 3 business days. And if you are eligible for CEs, you will also be receiving a detailed email within 2 to 3 business days. Any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us at ctac.info@nyu.edu. And with that, on behalf of CTAC and our presenter, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Diana, Leslie, and your entire crew at CTAC. Appreciate it.